Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on North Carolina occupancy taxes. Your questions answered. This is a Q&A format. Chris Kavanaugh with Magellan Strategy Group. He and I are going to have a Q&A, a back and forth, talking about some of the most common questions that come up regarding occupancy tax. We will then, after we go through the presentation and our Q&A, we would love to solicit questions from the audience, and you can put those in the chat. Taylor will read those. I will read those. And Chris, our expert on North Carolina occupancy tax, will give us his information. We thank you so much for being here, and welcome to another Uplift webinar. So I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Chris Kavanaugh. He has so much experience in the field. I'm not going to take long to do it. However, Chris is here with us today, not because he is a destination marketing organization leader. He is not a director of DLOs. He does not deal with occupancy taxes in that way on a daily basis. But Chris researches occupancy taxes. He has a historic knowledge of the North Carolina occupancy tax legislation in our state, outside of our state, and works with a lot of local DLOs, destination leadership organizations, who of course employ the occupancy tax. So Chris, thank you so much for being here with us today, and thanks for being willing to do this experimental format.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to be here. Happy Monday, everyone. And I'm delighted. This is a good turnout for what can be a rather esoteric subject at times. I am here hopefully to demystify some of the questions and myths, if you will, around occupancy taxes in the state of North Carolina. And it's a subject about which I'm personally very passionate about. There's probably like two of us across the old North State. And I think I've met the other person, but I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you. And thank you for being here.
So Chris, I think the first question should just be pretty basic. What is occupancy tax and who collects it?
Excellent question to get us started. So the concept of an occupancy tax or lodging tax, as it's called in some other communities or states, is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. It's a small charge that is placed on the bill of a guest who has rented a sleeping room overnight. And that sleeping room can be in a hotel, motel, bed and breakfast, short-term rental or vacation rental. It can be a room in somebody's house. It can be an entire house. And it's a small charge placed on the cost of the retail cost of that to the guest. And it is collected by the owner or in some cases by the facilitator of the rental. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Or, like I said, in some cases by the facilitator of the rental. And then that revenue, that small charge is then sent by the owner or facilitator to the county or municipal finance office where that rental occurs. And then it's used for a wide variety of different purposes. But mostly in North Carolina, it's invested in one of two areas. It's invested in destination promotion or in what we call tourism-related expenditures, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on as well. But fairly simple concept. And the concept of occupancy tax has really the same from state to state. Our laws, though, in North Carolina are quite a bit different from a lot of other states. So we'll focus mostly today upon North Carolina.
Awesome. Well, you touched a little bit on this, but could you go into more detail about why it's collected and what is that used for?
Absolutely. So let's talk first about what is in the majority of places in North Carolina. This small charge that's collected by the owner or the facilitator and then remitted to a county finance office or a municipal finance office is then usually reinvested. It's usually invested in one of two areas by what's called a tourism development authority. Now, not every place in North Carolina has a tourism development authority, but most do. And that's a board of usually stakeholders from the local community, typically includes lodging owners, tourism business owners, sometimes elected officials or other economic development staff. And it's invested in primarily two different ways in the state, but that's not true everywhere, but it's invested in two different ways. The first is destination promotion. Pretty simple. What do we do to market our community as a place that you might want to come and visit? And that includes everything from advertising, salaries associated with the administration of those activities, social media, public relations, marketing research, variety of different activities that we all lump into this group of things called destination promotion. The other thing that is a little trickier and a lot harder to explain in some ways are three actually very simple words. They can be invested in many places in North Carolina in what we call tourism-related expenditures. You see it up there, those three magic words up on the screen. And those words can be interpreted pretty broadly by the local community, by the local tourism development authority. And tourism-related expenditures can encompass a wide variety of things. It includes everything from debt service associated with, say, building a convention center or a civic center or some type of conference center in your community, to giving grants for events, to doing things like wayfinding signage or operating your visitor center, any number of different things that we call tourism-related expenditures. And that's a pretty broad term. And there's no real hard and fast specific definition in North Carolina as to what a tourism-related expenditure is or what it is not.
Okay, so you mentioned salaries, you mentioned all the things we could spend it on. I guess I have a two-part question. Are there restrictions on how they could be spent? What's to keep me from paying myself all 100% of the occupancy tax collected for my salary?
So great question. And typically in North Carolina, again, not every community, but in the majority of communities and destinations in North Carolina, the legislation that guides the investment of those occupancy taxes is highly specific to that local community. So if you are in, say, Stanley County, where Chris Lambert is today, out there in Albemarle, he has very specific legislation that guides how money collected in Stanley County can be spent. That legislation for the local community usually explains how the money can be spent. So in the majority of communities in North Carolina, at least 2/3 of the occupancy tax revenue has to be reinvested in what we call, at least 2/3 has to be called reinvested in what we call destination promotion. And those are the activities I just listed. That also includes, as noted here, that also includes that also includes the salaries for the people that are needed to administer those activities. Your executive director, for instance, your staff, someone on your staff who maybe does social media or is responsible for community engagement. That's considered to be part of that 2/3 of destination promotion. Now, the other 1/3 is that tourism-related expenditures. And as I said, there's usually not much explanation in most communities as to what that means. We know that generally accepted allowable investments include some of the things I listed before. Supporting the development of convention centers, conference centers, wayfinding signage, greenways and parks, sports complexes. What it does not allow for are things like, say, Um, most communities say sanitation, fire, police. Now, there are a handful of communities out there on the coast of North Carolina that have some legislation that specifically allows them to spend money on those kinds of municipal services. But in most communities, that's generally not considered to be a tourism related expenditure. Um, Also, I should note too, if you're spending money on destination promotion and you decide to give grants to local event organizers, um, that's considered to be those grants, if they're coming from that pot of money that's for destination promotion, those grants can be used for marketing. But if I spend money, say, on an event and I rent porta potties, or I have a killer band come in, I want to pay the band booking fee, that's got to come out of the pot of money for tourism related expenditures. Now, someone asked from Pender County about beach nourishment. If you're out there on the coast of North Carolina, beach nourishment is incredibly important to you as a tourism asset. Really important. That's the reason people come to places like Pender County, to Topsail Island. It's the reason that people go to the Outer Banks. And that is recognized in most communities out there as an acceptable expenditure of tourism related expenditure money. So that's usually highly specific in the local legislation for those communities.
Chris, have you heard of any really creative ways that this tax has been spent that you could even recommend?
Yeah, so historically, we've seen communities use this tax money, particularly on the 1/3 for tourism-related expenditures. They use this for event grants. That's one of the most popular ways of investing those dollars in events that help bring visitors to the community. And every community's got popular events, some of which are more popular with residents than they are with visitors. But most communities have very popular events like a barbecue festival, an okra festival, whatever it may be that brings people into the community. What we're seeing though is a lot more creative uses of that 1/3 of pot, 1/3 of revenue that can be allocated to tourism related expenditures around things like public artwork. We're seeing a lot of that. Murals, for instance, sculpture, public outdoor sculpture. We're also seeing it for other kinds of placemaking initiatives. And I know you've got a webinar coming up this week on placemaking. A lot of great things going on with placemaking, particularly things that celebrate local history, local artisans. And that's one of the great things I've seen. We've seen some really cool things done and even very small communities around placemaking and public art and murals, for instance. And they're great because they can help tell a story of the community, of the people that helped shape that community or went on to do incredible things outside of that community as well. There's a great series of murals across North Carolina now that celebrate local music heroes, and just some great, and even the smallest communities. And that's usually a very affordable way of investing that money into something that's not only tells the story of the community, but is also a great selfie opportunity. And we're seeing more and more communities recognize that that's a good way of extending the power of their community as a marketing tool.
Those are really good examples and fun examples of some product development.
Yeah, a
Um,
lot of great things being done on product development. Doesn't take a whole lot at all of money to make a difference in a community.
That's right. Well, and Taylor put the placemaking webinar link in the chat, so folks can sign up for that. It's coming up in 2 days. We're so excited about that. I love placemaking. I have been following Project for Public Spaces, pps.org, for years. It just is so applicable to tourism and the quality of life. So I'm really excited. I hope everyone here is there also. I see you on Wednesday.
Yeah, that's something I'm really passionate about, and I know that everyone on this webinar and elsewhere will do a great job. Hear a lot of great ideas. But yeah, North Carolina doing some, and this is a great way of using these dollars, that 1/3 pot of money, as a way of, again, creating something that makes your community even more unique, and shows the world how unique it is.
Well, so when did North Carolina start collecting occupancy tax? And is that legislated at the state level or the local level?
So the first occupancy tax legislation was passed by the General Assembly in North Carolina in 1983. So we're now 40 years into this funding mechanism for destination leadership organizations.
And see, I thought that sounded like just yesterday.
Well, I did too, and it's a reminder of how old I'm getting. I first came to North Carolina in 1995, which it's hard to believe that was only 12 years after the first occupancy tax was created in North Carolina. And I think some of the first destinations were Haywood County was one of the first. Buncombe County, I know where I am right now, was one of the first communities to have a occupancy tax. And it was first collected in 1983. And it's entirely legislated at the state level. So if you want to, in most cases, either modify your existing occupancy tax legislation, or you want to create one for the first time, which counties like Bertie and Stokes this past year just got the authorization from the legislature to create their first occupancy tax and first tourism development authority. If you want to do that, either modify or create it for the first time, it's legislated at the state level. And it's, you generally only can make one change at the local level. In some communities, the county board of commissioners or the town council can adjust the level of the rate. That is usually the rate of taxation between 1% and 6% is usually set at the local level. Other than that, there's really not much more that you can do at the local level, at least in terms of your elected officials. There's a lot that your Tourism Development Authority can do in terms of shaping policy and process. And I always like to say that Tourism Development Authority really has three components. There's the legislation, which is the mandate that comes down on high from Raleigh, that says that's the legislation that governs your particular community. And then there's the policy and process. And that's really those two are really shaped at the local level in terms of how you invest those dollars in your community, whether it be in destination promotion or tourism related expenditure. That's really determined largely at the local level by your Tourism Development Authority board.
And I'm assuming that policy at the local level can be changed if, through going through the normal public process. So policy that's created this year could be changed 15 years from now, if that's a relevant thing to do.
Yeah, and policy is really set by the Tourism Development Authority board, and potentially they could change policy in terms of doing things like grants, for instance. We're only going to invest in our tourism-related expenditures in events, or we decide next year we want to invest it in placemaking, so we're going to do placemaking grants, or we're going to support a large project. We may say, gosh, we've got a conference center we want to build, and we're going to devote our tourism-related expenditures to debt service on that conference center, for instance. And then process is really how do you go about investing those dollars? That's everything from having a public hearing around the budget to everything from doing grants. How do you do grants in your community? Is there a grant application process? So talking about the legislation, we just segue right into that. It really starts either in terms of changing your legislation or establishing it the first time. It really starts with outreach and dialogue to your local legislative delegation. You have to have their support really to get anything done in Raleigh that affects your community. And it's about going to them and starting a discussion and a dialogue with your local elected leaders in the House and Senate and getting them to sponsor a bill. From there, it goes typically to the Finance Committee in the Senate. And then they're typically responsible for evaluating bills that are occupancy tax related. Once it gets through committee and is approved by committee, it then has to be approved by both the House and the Senate. That's usually pretty simple once it gets through committee. And this year, we had one of the biggest collection of occupancy tax bills passed in Raleigh. They were all bundled into a single piece of legislation, and they all basically had to meet or be in conformity with the occupancy tax guidelines. And those guidelines were first passed in 1997, and they basically govern the look of and language of occupancy taxes. They say that unless you're a coastal community with beaches and you're investing in beach nourishment, they say that you can spend up at least 2/3 of money in destination promotion. And those guidelines say you can spend no more than 1/3 on tourism-related expenditures. If you've got legislation that predates 1997, there's a good chance it may not conform with those guidelines. But since 1997, most, not all, legislation conforms with those guidelines.
Pretty interesting stuff, Chris. Let's start with the visitor who pays for some sort of lodging and the occupancy tax is paid. Can you outline the process from that tourist, how the money flows to the DLO?
Right. Very good question. So when the guest checks out of their lodging and they vacate their lodging and receives their folio, that's usually noted on that folio the amount of sales tax that is paid, because they're also paying sales tax on the cost of their lodging. And then it notes what the lodging tax was. Now, I know that there are some hotels, probably some short-term rental providers, that only show that number as just taxes, which includes state taxes or sales taxes and occupancy taxes. So here's where it gets interesting. Let's say if you're a local hotel, typically, and you've had a guest stay in your hotel, and typically that local hotel is responsible for remitting the tax on a monthly basis to their county or municipal finance office. County, if it's a county-wide tourism development authority or TDA, municipal finance office if it's a city or a town TDA. So they have to fill out a form, and now it's oftentimes a lot of counties and cities now have it so that you can do that online. You don't even have to mail it in anymore, and that's a much easier process. A lot of finance offices have made it so you can pay that tax online. So that's the most prevalent for hotels and lodging, that is. But there's two other ways that we know occupancy taxes can be collected. One way is if you've got vacation rentals. Vacation rentals, if they're being booked on Vrbo, VRBO, or Airbnb, Vrbo and Airbnb are paying at the state level. So let's say you book book your beach rental through Airbnb. You get down there for a week. You have a great time on the North Carolina beaches, and you pay entirely through Vrbo or Airbnb. Well, Vrbo or Airbnb will see that rental occurred in, say, Currituck County, and they will remit a check, one check each month to the Department of Revenue. That's for all 100 counties in terms of if they have an occupancy tax. That shows basically, here's how much occupancy tax was generated in the entire state. And they'll submit a report to the Department of Revenue that says, okay, X amount was collected in for our rentals on VRBO or Airbnb in Caswell County. X amount was collected in Stanley County. X amount was collected in Wake County. The Department of Revenue then takes that and says, hey, Wake County, we're going to send you a check because Vrbo or Airbnb says this is how much occupancy tax revenue was generated at the local level. And so that's usually how that happens for Airbnb and VRBO rentals. But let's say you're a local rental agency. Let's say you're an agency like Jenkins Realty up in the high country, for instance, which have been around for years renting cabins and chalets up in the high country. And let's say you rent directly through them. Well, they're a facilitator of that rental. They're responsible then for paying that tax in, say, Watauga County. Or if you're out on the Outer Banks and you rent with the same rental agency every year, you don't even bother going to VRBO or Airbnb, then again, you're responsible for, as a facilitator, for collecting that tax and sending it to the local finance office. Same is true if say, you, Carol, decide to rent out your room and you post an ad on Craigslist, or you've got a website, carolkleinsbedroom.com, and you're booking that way, then you, Carol, would be responsible for sending in that payment of occupancy taxes to your local finance office. It's ultimately the responsibility of either the owner or the facilitator, and that facilitator could either be a local owner, a local realty company, or a giant company like Airbnb, VRBO, or Expedia, or Booking.com.
That's super confusing.
Well, it was even worse, and it is even worse in states that don't have an agreement with Airbnb and VRBO.
Right.
In some cases, believe it or not, in some places, VRBO and Airbnb still aren't paying occupancy taxes. And so
Are
it's
they collecting it? Are they collecting it?
depends on the local jurisdiction.
Oh.
I used to before we had the state agreements with VRBO and Airbnb, there were all kinds of ways that counties and cities were pursuing the payment of taxes and trying to track down owners. And that's true still in a lot of places around the country, where they're not necessarily paying at either the state or county or municipal level, and the owner then is responsible for paying those taxes. It's entirely up to the individual owner at that point.
So you mentioned how does lodging pay monthly to the local? Okay. But when does the DLO get that money? On an annual basis or quarterly?
Great question. So in a lot of places, it usually takes place on a monthly basis, where the finance office then transfers the money or is responsible in many cases for managing the finances of the TDA. And that money goes into their account on a monthly basis. I do know, though, there are still some places in North Carolina where that money or that transfer into a TDA account only occurs on a quarterly basis.
Okay. And then same question, but at the state level, collecting that, when does that get distributed?
That's on a monthly basis.
Okay.
So your local finance office gets a check from the state each month that shows how much money was generated by Airbnb in your community and how much was generated by VRBO. And you can go to your local finance office and ask for that amount of money. Now, what you can't do is ask them, because they don't know, and the state doesn't know either, well, who are the rentals, where are the rentals in my county that generated that money? That was part of the deal. VRBO and Airbnb said, yeah, we'll pay all the taxes, but we're not going to tell you who our owners are or where our rentals are located.
But I could do a search in my own county on Airbnb and VRBO. I mean, it wouldn't be perfect, but I could get a general idea, maybe?
You could. And there's a couple of ways. Of doing this. One is called is a software platform called Granicus, which a number of municipalities have subscribed to. And Granicus basically does the work for the county or the municipality to try to track down where those rentals are occurring in your county. We see this a lot in places that are trying to regulate the presence of vacation rentals and have regulations in place. around which districts they can occur in. But it is a bit like a mole hunt, okay? It's a bit like whack-a-mole in terms of trying to track down where those rentals are occurring. Now, if you want to, there's a free platform too called AirDNA. And I know some of the destination leadership organizations in the state subscribe to reporting from AirDNA. But there's actually a free service on AirDNA. You can go to airdna.com and you can plug in a zip code or a city, and it will attempt to show you where VRBO and Airbnb rentals are occurring. Not the specific address necessarily, but you can pretty much hone in and see how many you have on a regular monthly basis and where they're occurring.
Interesting. Granicus and AirDNA. One of the participants in the webinar has confirmed your whack-a-mole an analogy, that the search for Airbnb will change each time. It'll never show each Airbnb or VRBO.
Yeah, and keep in mind that unlike hotels and say bed and breakfast, traditional bed and breakfast, owners can pull their listing at any time off of Airbnb or VRBO. They can pull that listing and it's no longer there, and it'll show up again next month. So yeah, it's not consistent from month to month, or they may decide we've got a long-term rental. If someone who wants to rent the property for long-term, and in North Carolina, if it's a rental lasting more than 90 days, you don't pay occupancy tax on it.
So one of the participants in the webinar said that the tax, okay, make sure to contact the county to receive the tax, or the municipality from Airbnb, because it isn't required to go to the TDA. Are you?
That's true, and it actually, this actually speaks to something I talk about a lot: the importance of establishing good relationship with your local finance office. Because they are ultimately the entity that's responsible for both the collection of those taxes, the penalties associated with them if someone is late payment or doesn't pay, and also the remission of those dollars to the local tourism development authority. And so making sure that they have you have a good relationship with them. Remember too that in most places, yeah, the county or local finance office gets a cut of the money that comes in for the administration of that. But in most places in North Carolina, all of that money, once that administrative fee has been taken, goes to the TDA. And so sometimes motivating the local finance office getting the local finance office to be motivated to get that money to the TDA can be a challenge.
So you were referencing earlier the report. There's a report that says how much each county gets from the Airbnb and the VRBO. Is that a publicly, could I access that report?
Yeah, you can. And in fact, I encourage this. I encourage the your local TDA to find out how much of the occupancy tax they generated comes from vacation rentals. And that's a number that your local finance office should have. Now, again, they can't tell you who those properties are. They're not allowed to by state law. They're also not allowed to say that the Acme Motel generated X amount of tax revenue either. I know that in some places in the state, when I first started as a consultant 19 years ago, there was some places in the state that were actually showing how much each hotel or motel in the county was paying in occupancy tax. And that's actually illegal. You can't do that.
Yeah, that is proprietary information.
Yep.
And just to explain why, if it's not obvious to everyone, if you know how much occupancy tax is collected, then you can do some math to find out what the revenue is, and not every business wants that information out there with their competitors to know as well.
Exactly. And yes, and the Department of Revenue is not going to provide that report for you in terms of how much, but hopefully your local finance office can provide that.
Great. So you and I have talked about this relationship between the occupancy tax and the sales tax. What is that quick relationship?
Yeah, so that just a good reminder too, that every guest has to pay, if you pay occupancy tax, you're also paying sales tax, which should help motivate your local finance office also in terms of the collection of those taxes and the distribution of that money to the Tourism Development Authority. So that's an important point to note. It's also an important point to note that generally nonprofits are not accepted, not accepted, not accepted, but accepted from the payment of occupancy taxes. That's another key point here. Unless it's in the service of their mission, as say a youth camp, or as a religious conference center. But if, say, you're a religious conference center and you decide to rent some rooms to an individual who wants to come visit your destination, for instance, Lake Junaluska does a great job with it. They've renovated a lot of their inventory, and if you want to stay at Lake Junaluska, you can do that and not be part of a religious conference. But you will pay occupancy tax, even though Lake Junaluska is a Methodist conference center that is, by its definition, a nonprofit.
Okay, it's just getting more and more confusing. Let's move on to how the collection of occupancy taxes is enforced.
Okay, so ultimately, this is a really interesting question. So there are a few tools available to your local finance office in the pursuit of this. The first thing, though, before I get into that, is to note that you have to inform people who are renting rooms, or you have to inform owners who are renting rooms or renting out cabins. If they're not doing it through, say, Airbnb or VRBO, they are liable for the collection of those occupancy taxes. So it's important to get the word out through local media. Or I know in a couple of cases in North Carolina, the local TDA has paid for the insertion of a flyer into the annual property tax notice that goes out. And they'll say, can you send this out to all residents to let them know that if they're renting a room out or renting a cabin out and they're not doing it through Airbnb or VRBO, they have to pay the occupancy tax at the local level. So you first have to take steps to make sure that people in your community know about this. Secondly, working with your county finance office, your finance office does have some options available. First of all, there are penalties. So the local finance office can apply a penalty of 5% per month up to a max of 25% for any late returns. They can also apply a penalty of 10% if there's tax owed for late payment. So let's say that the owner or the landlord or the owner of the lodging property is making partial payments. Well, they can apply either a late return fee and or a late payment fee on those taxes. And ultimately, it's up to the TDA board to decide whether or not they want to waive that. And I've seen that happen in some places where a general manager of a hotel comes to the TDA board and said, you know, we had someone who was out for a while with sickness, our night auditor or our accountant was out with sickness or out on maternity leave or out for an extended period of time, and we just didn't take care of it. And I've seen TDA boards waive that penalty in some cases. Beyond that, it's up to the finance office to garnish basically the income being generated by that property. Now, they can't apply a lien, according to North Carolina law, they can't apply a lien like they could on if they were for non-payment of property taxes, but they can garnish income being generated by that property. If you're a TDA, the best thing you can do is, if they're not paying the tax, pull the listing for that hotel, or if you've got individual listings for vacation rentals, pull those listings off your website. Don't promote them. They're basically flaunting the law at that point.
Great. Yeah, that's harsh, but good. Um, very good, but necessary. If I'm a DLO, I want to know that the right amount of money is coming to me because I want every single dollar that I can use. But also if I'm an attraction, if I'm a hotel, if I'm a restaurant, I want to know if the right amount of money is being provided to my DLO so that they can promote to the whole region. How do I know if that's happening?
It is a tricky question. There is no perfect way to know for sure, because essentially everyone involved in this is paying on the honor system. If you're the county finance office, unless you use one of these platforms like Granicus that I mentioned earlier, unless you're using one of those kinds of platforms, which is um, consistently imperfect, shall we say, I don't know where those rentals are occurring. Now, I have seen some counties, particularly rural areas, do some research where they try to identify all of the vacation rentals in their community. But that's really tough if you're in a place like Buncombe County, for instance, which has a very large number of them. Watauga County, up in Boone and Blowing Rock, out on the beach destinations. It's really hard. So the best thing you can do is tell people about the tax, make sure that they're aware of it, and then just continue to monitor as best you can that your hotels and your vacation rentals are paying. But it is largely on the honor system.
Guys, that's a lot for the DLO to have to do in addition to all of their other responsibilities.
It is. And again, it tells you why the relationship with your finance office is so important.
Yeah. Well, here's an easy question for you, Chris. How many counties have occupancy tax in North Carolina?
Okay, so as of the most recent legislative session at the end of October, we now have 90 counties, 90 out of 100, that have occupancy tax legislation in North Carolina. And I know we have, as an audience here, a participant in our webinar, someone from one of the counties that does not have the legislation, Bladen
Yes.
County. But most of the counties that do not have the legislation, countywide legislation, are in the eastern part of the state.
Yeah.
And places like Jones County,
Jones,
for
yeah.
instance, I know is one. Gates County is another. Now, there are a handful of places that do have a city or a town that might have might have an occupancy tax. So there may not be a countywide tax, but there may be a town in that county that does have occupancy tax. But most counties now are moving in that direction because of vacation rentals. It used to be that the towns, you knew where your hotels were. You either knew you had a hotel or you didn't have a hotel. Vacation rentals now obviously become very popular, especially since the pandemic. And now can be found in just about, I'm guessing, every county in North Carolina.
Well, and we're going to be showing a report that you do. You do a report every year on occupancy tax. And I'm sure in that report, there is documentation of those 90, what percentage they're all collecting. What's to be done if you are a county that's collecting 3% now, but you want to up that to maybe 6%?
Yeah, so there's two ways of going about that. One is look and see if your legislation allows for your county commission, for instance, or your town council to go from 3 up to 6. Or you'll have to go back to Raleigh and get the legislation changed. And that's usually pretty easy. Yes, you could have a local member of your delegation say, I'm anti-tax, I'm anti-all taxes, or I don't want to do this, which has happened. But in most cases, getting it changed from, say, 3 to 6% in Raleigh is not very difficult to do. That's probably not going to happen this year because it's a short session. So it'll probably be 2025 before that could occur. But it's one of those things you just go to your local delegation and tell them what you want to do. Tell them the benefits, explain the benefits of what else you would do for the community and how it would benefit the local economy, and go and get them. By the way, 6% is the top rate that you can charge a consumer in North Carolina,
Yeah,
with the exception of Mecklenburg County, which has an 8% rate. They have a special 2% tax that goes to fund the NASCAR Hall of Fame.
yeah,
And I should also mention that occupancy taxes are different than prepared meals taxes.
right.
There are 5 communities in North Carolina that have prepared meals taxes, but we haven't seen any of those passed in North Carolina since the mid 1990s.
Very good. Well, Chris, we've talked about Airbnbs and VRBO, but what about online travel companies, online travel agencies? What do they collect tax?
Potentially, yes. So in a lot of places, if you're a guest and you make your reservation at your local Holiday Inn Express or at the Holiday Inn Express where you're going on vacation or for business, um, and you make it directly through the company, the owner of the hotel, the local owner, is responsible then for making that payment. Based again on the retail value of the tax. Now, back about 10 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about OTAs, online travel agencies. And these are basically the entities that are owned by, for hotels, by 2 companies, Expedia and Booking Holdings. And Booking Holdings owns Booking.com. I think they own Priceline, Kayak. And if you book a hotel reservation there, usually what happens on one of those services, again, the OTA is responsible for remitting the tax on the full retail value of that room rental. Now, let's say it's a package deal. Let's say it's a package that includes attraction tickets or includes some other massage, for instance, at the local hotel. Those services are not charged occupancy tax. It's just on the value of the room. It's not on the value of additional tickets or activities or things like spa services. That tax is usually remitted by the OTA to your local finance office.
Now you've got me thinking about spa services. Um, what about rental companies like, renting a cabin or a cottage?
Yep, and again, that's particularly true in a number of places across the state. Now, if the booking occurs, let's say you're a rental company and they are a rental company that's helping facilitate rentals for Carol's garage apartment. And a guest books that garage apartment through the rental company. And many vacation destinations in the state have these rental companies. Well, if it's a local rental company, like I talked about earlier, Jenkins Realty up in the high country being one of those. Or if you're out on the Outer Banks, there's a number of different rental companies out there. If you book locally through them, again, the occupancy tax is paid by the rental company on the full value of that rental for that house or that room. If you book through, it could be also that you're listed with a local rental company, but also listed on Airbnb or VRBO. And I've certainly seen that happen in a lot of places where there are 2 different ways or in some cases, maybe 3 different ways or more different ways of booking the same room. It all depends on who the facilitator is of that rental. If it's Airbnb and VRBO, that money goes to the State Department of Revenue, as described earlier, who then sends it back down to where the rental occurred. If it's a local rental company, that rental company is the local facilitator. They collect the occupancy tax, send it to the local finance office.
Gotcha. That is complicated. Okay. So what about campgrounds? They're also tricky.
Been getting a lot more questions about this. Campgrounds are definitely tricky. So one of the things that we see with campgrounds is that generally tent campgrounds or a place for parking your RV, an RV slot at a commercial campground are not considered as permanent structures, okay? But what about a cabin at that campground? Well, yeah, then that campground has to pay the cost of the occupancy tax. A good question just popped up here. Do state parks collect an occupancy tax for cabin rentals? No, they do not. And that's I know a sore subject in some communities that have that. So campgrounds are tricky though, because it used to be back in the day that when we talked about campgrounds, we generally thought only about like RV slots or tent camping. You bring your tent, you pitch it like you would in a national park campground or Forest Service. Well, now we've got all these broad definitions of what a campground is. We've got glamping, we've got yurts, tree houses.
Tree houses,
Um,
camping platforms on the river.
yes, absolutely. Or, even RVs that have become like permanent structures, if you will. So in a lot of those cases, if it's a quote permanent structure that has walls and that campground is providing it,
That you sleep in, not the bathroom, not the public
right?
bathroom.
Yes. Good point. Very good point. If the campground's providing those permanent structures as a form of accommodation, it probably should be charged occupancy tax. But this is a big issue in a number of communities that really rely a lot on campgrounds as overnight accommodations. And to be honest, there's nothing in North Carolina law that spells out specifically what should be charged occupancy tax and what should not be. So that again is going to come down to a judgment of your local finance office working with your Tourism Development Authority board.
I hope people who are not running DLOs are getting starting to get an appreciation of what a DLO director is working with on a day-to-day basis. It's complicated.
It is.
What about hunting lodges? And what about timeshares, Chris?
All right. So again, neither one's spelled out specifically. If you're a hunting lodge, and let's say you're a member of that hunting lodge, you're not a transient guest. And I've talked to an attorney who specializes in occupancy taxes about both of these. If you're a member and you're not a transient guest, that's not considered to be that you can charge occupancy tax on that. If you have a timeshare, you're the owner of that timeshare, you're not paying occupancy tax because you're considered an owner. However, if you, the owner of that timeshare, decide to sublet that, then yes, you would have to pay occupancy tax on that if you collect income. Now, I will say this: there's one other thing in North Carolina law. Let's say, Carol, you want to charge a brother or a sister of yours who's going to come stay with you, and you want to charge them rent. But let's say you decide, you know what, I'm going to occasionally make some money off the rental of a room in my house. That's a better example.
No, both ways sound like me. That's
well, if you rent for less than 15 days a year, you shouldn't be paying occupancy tax. So occasionally there may be, someone, you may decide to make some quick money if you're have a big event. Let's say you're up in say North Wilkesboro, and you decide you want to rent your house out for 14 days out of the year. You don't have to pay occupancy tax. You're up in North Wilkesboro and you're only renting it around the race, around NASCAR Speedway, or events there. You do not have to pay occupancy tax according to North Carolina law. And any occupancy tax that you do pay should be rebated back to you. Another along the same lines, the 90-day rule. And this is something actually App State ran into during COVID. App State during COVID rented a whole bunch of hotel rooms during the pandemic to spread students out. Those rentals, they were paying occupancy tax on in these local hotels. But then 90 days came and they were no longer short-term rentals. They were at that point longer-term rentals, even though they were occurring in hotels. The Boone TDA had to rebate money back to App State for those occupancy taxes that were charged on those rentals. So that's another example of an entity that did not have to pay occupancy tax, even though they were renting those rooms.
So back to hunting a minute. is it, what about if just land is leased to hunt on? Does there need to be that structure like camping?
No, generally, again, if that would be considered, if you're bringing your own tent or your own form of lodging, then no, that would not be considered to be a taxable accommodation.
But if there is a lodge,
If there's a lodge and I'm just a transient guest, and I have no ownership stake in it, then yes, that would be a taxable accommodation.
okay, even like, so if I'm staying there for 3 months,
Exactly 3 months or a little more than 3 months.
yeah, then it goes back to the 90-day.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And then did we cover timeshares, everything we need to know about timeshares?
Yeah, timeshare owner would be considered an owner. So it would be the same as someone like you, Carol, in your palatial 12-bedroom house out on the Outer Banks that you are going to invite us all to after this webinar is over. So if you stay in that house and don't rent it out for money, but you're not going to charge us money, so that's okay.
Okay. Okay, got it. Okay, great. So what, are there any exemptions? We've covered a lot. We've covered like Airbnb and cabin rentals and hunting and state parks. Are there any exceptions to lodging regarding the collection of occupancy tax?
The only other thing I should bring up that we haven't discussed is
Okay.
that state employees or federal government employees who use a state or federal credit card issued by the government do not have to pay occupancy tax. Interesting enough, though, local government officials are subject to occupancy tax, even if they're paying with a local government issued credit card.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Now, if let's say you're a state employee and you are using your own personal credit card, that's taxable. You would have to use a government issued credit card in order to be exempt from occupancy tax.
Okay. All right. Now, all right. So where do I go to get a report or documentation about how much tax was collected at my county?
Your county finance office and hopefully your destination leadership office should be able to provide that. That should, the local TDA office should be able to provide that. The state also, Department of Revenue, also issues a report every year, which you can find as part of the report that is downloadable from my website.
Okay.
You can also find it on the Visit and See Partners portion of their website that shows how much each year each county collects in occupancy tax. The only drawback is that it takes the Department of Revenue a long time to get to that report because, again, they're not getting any money from occupancy taxes. And so it takes them literally about a year to collect and report that data.
Okay. Very, very good. So I think at this point we can talk about some of the questions that were in the chat that we haven't gotten to, but also I'd like to put the link in the chat to your report.
Yep, it's downloadable, free of charge. It's a great sleep aid if you're not sleeping well tonight. And I will say that we're in the process of updating it with the latest changes that occurred at the end of 2023. If you go ahead and download the report now. In about a week, we'll have the updated report up for download. But if you download it now, I'll make sure that in about a week you get the revised report as well.
Hey, cool. Thank you, Chris. So one question that we were not able to address in terms of like TDAs and their use of the occupancy tax, have you seen any, gaps in the system? Have there been any ways that TDAs have exposed themselves or any weaknesses in the system?
Sure. A couple of things come to mind. The tourism related expenditures has been unfortunately exploited by some TDAs as a way of funding some initiatives that are pretty questionable. I'll just give a couple of examples, and not to get into too specific an example, but I know in one county it was used to help fund a local high school athletic team, and was used to help fund in return for those athletes. Those high school athletes working special events for the TDA. That's probably pretty questionable as a tourism-related expenditure. And right now the biggest controversy with regards to North Carolina recently around the use of occupancy taxes is occurring up in Currituck County, and I won't go into a lot of detail around that. But basically, you have a group of owners in Currituck County, owners of large rental homes, who are suing their TDA because they say that not enough money as required by law has gone into beach nourishment out on the beaches out there in Currituck County. And you can read all about that. It's currently under appeal. That's an unusual instance, though. It's the only place where I know of where in North Carolina where the Tourism Development Authority consists entirely of the county commissioners. So rather than in most cases, you've got TDAs that include owners of lodging or tourism-related businesses. That's one of the only cases I'm aware of where that's not the case. Again, you can go read. I'm not going to go into detail about it online, but that's probably one of the biggest things. So those are a couple of examples. Again, a lot of it goes to that idea of what's a tourism-related expenditure, and that really relies on the local tourism partners to make sure that those dollars are being invested correctly.
Okay, well, if we could go back to the slide with the QR code on it, that is the way to download Chris's report. You pull up that page and you scroll down, and you'll be able to see where you can download that report. There we go. That's the slide we want. Now, Chris, we're wrapping up the webinar here. We're running a little bit over. So excited to have this information from you and recorded because it is complex. If a county or municipality has a question about the tax, I'm assuming they can get a hold of you.
Yes, please do not hesitate to email me or call me. We love to talk about this. I get calls all the time from people asking me. I'm not an attorney. I will remind everyone of that. But I can make some recommendations or cite some instances in other places of the state around effective uses of the tax, ways to communicate to your local residents about the tax, and a number of other issues that many destination leadership organizations face.
Very good. I wish we had more time, but we don't. Chris, thank you so much for being here. Thanks everyone in the audience. I'm assuming most questions were answered. We think we addressed everything in the chat. Thank you all so much for being here. If we need to do, round two, oh, what do you call it when the movie you do like a sequel? If we need to do a sequel, then I'm sure Chris would be up for that.
Hopefully not a remake. Hopefully a sequel and not a remake.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Thanks everyone for being here.